Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just another tinfoil hat. Welcome to my show. Today we are going to be discussing the possibility of biological UFOs. And yes, I did say biological UFOs and not biological UFO occupants. This is a concept that's really exciting to me. It's the idea that some sightings of UFOs may be due to sightings of actual living animate organisms as opposed to inanimate objects like machines or energetic projections or manifestations. Now, before we go any further, as with any theory, I'm by no means saying that this accounts for all or even most sightings of unidentified flying objects. When it comes to this phenomenon, you really have a boatload, or maybe a flying saucer load, of different types of objects reported. Their unifying characteristics really are that they're not identifiable as any known thing and that they're in the sky or aerial, which honestly does make UAP or unidentified aerial phenomenon a slightly better term than unidentified flying object, which denotes an action which few such objects possess. However, even with UAP, then you have kind of the tricky issue of unidentified submerged objects, as well as those seen on land. So maybe eventually we'll get to the point where a simple UP, and I don't mean the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but unidentified phenomenon will be the new norm. But anyway, before we go any further down this very rickety pier, let's return to the original idea of the premise under its current label, UFOs. As mentioned previous, there's a whole heck of a lot of different types of objects reported in our skies, and that is precisely the issue with trying to fit them all into the same bin. I mean, where exactly do you place the Ace of Spades shaped craft, that was associated with the Flatwoods Monster? Does it fit in with cigarette-shaped objects, one of the most commonly reported types, or with the sparkly craft of Simonton's famous flying flapjacks? Where do you put rainfalls of blood, or the black unmarked helicopters that mysteriously show up and then just as mysteriously vanish at will? Point being, when looking at the UFO problem, we really need to be prepared that there may be innumerable answers to the question, what is this stuff? And that one answer doesn't negate any or all of the other answers out there. So, all that said, on to the task at hand. So, the idea that some UFOs may be biological entities has been garnering a lot more attention recently than it has in the near past. And this is due, I would say, to a certain influx of sightings of a very particular type, the so-called sky mantas. I've been seeing these reports all over the place, people seeing these typically very large, typically mainly translucent, sometimes with a vague bioluminescent sheen type entities, which are described as looking almost exactly like marine manta rays, and moving like them as well in this kind of undulating sort of way. Now, flying jellyfish or sky jellyfish are another such type. Space worms, they were all over the place for a while, and even translucent squid-like entities. So this concept, like I mentioned, has been more in the public eye recently, although it also has been around since before ufology was even ufology at all. In the groundbreaking book Low, Charles Fort theorized that some sightings of unknown things in the sky may be due to organic life forms. And you'll see this echoed across later ufologists' work, such as the work of Trevor James Constable and Ivan T. Sanderson. So before we go any further, what would differentiate between a sighting of something that might be organic as opposed to something that is inorganic? And I know this seems like kind of an obvious question, but the truth is that it really varies depending on which researcher you're going with. In Sanderson's Uninvited Visitors, he took this concept way far out, even conceptualizing that some classic flying saucer sightings could be of bioengineered amoeba-like vehicles capable of transporting other life forms inside of them. I guess kind of like the cat bus from My Neighbor Totoro. So it's a really interesting take, and Sanderson is just a very interesting study as well. You can see across so much of his work that the dividing line between animate and inanimate is blurred, if not completely obliterated. As a biologist, the theoretical angle must have been just super intriguing to him, and he really wasn't afraid to walk down these paths of logic and reasoning that most people would cut off immediately, while at the same time not really rejecting or accepting any of them. So yeah, Sanderson is really cool. So for the sake of simplicity, the sightings that I'm referring to here are those that seem to lack obvious mechanical or non-organic qualities, and which do feature or appearances or behaviors that tend towards life forms as we understand them. So like I mentioned before, under this broad term of organic UFOs, you have these different kind of bizarrely named things, such as sky jellyfish, flying mantas, space worms, and these have also been termed atmospheric beasts or atmospheric organisms, of course pertaining to the idea that they live in our upper atmosphere. So, before we go any further, a quick note. What I am not talking about is the rod phenomenon, which is, unfortunately to ufology, what dust mote orb photos are to spectrology. And in talking about atmospheric beasts, I often see this kind of tied in. So rods are those visual artifacts that appear in photos and videos that do indeed look like some sort of bizarre segmented or frilled creature. I feel like I'm always offering disclaimers on mistaken identity photos and videos, and these guys are just particles, bugs, birds, objects that fly through the frame. The camera takes a little bit too long on the exposure, and bam, you've got this crazy looking thing, this anomalous thing, in all manner of apparent sizes, shapes, and colors. So, moving on from that. Under this umbrella of organic UFO sightings, there are many variations, similar to how there are many variations of the unknown craft variety. Most of these things appear to be non-geometric in construction, typically though not always semi-translucent, and often with a bioluminescent quality. Most reports mention that these objects move in a similar way to that of ocean creatures, kind of floating or undulating along through the air, just as genuine jellyfish and manta rays move through the ocean. Then a subset of this ties the manta-type entities to the mysterious black delta-shaped stealth craft. Other researchers suggest that orbs might even be bioluminescent organisms. So whereas most UFOs appear to consist of very metallic, rigid materials, among these sightings you'll see such descriptions as globular or blob-like, or like jelly or jello. There are even several accounts of people making physical contact with these things. My favorite description comes from a policeman from the 1950s who claimed that he ran into one and that it felt like a very soft blanket and smelled like mildew. So the question then remains, if there are such things as atmospheric beasts living in our skies, how? So as we're finding more and more as technology pushes us further and further along, life is capable of existing in extremely harsh conditions. Take, for example, the marine plankton growing on the International Space Station. And when I mean on the International Space Station, I mean on the exterior of the space station, like some sort of demented chia pet. And it's actually strongly suggested that this stuff wasn't picked up from any launch site, it was actually carried on updrafts and somehow latched onto the station. Recently, studies have also confirmed that microorganisms and even fungal particles can exist and live in our upper atmospheres, some of them surviving quite well because they actually feed off of compounds found up in our skies. So this brings up the issue, if there is life in the sky, what does it metabolize? And there are several different answers for this question. First off, if you take a look at the giant tube worm, it actually has a symbiotic relationship with chemosynthetic bacteria which lives inside of it, which allows it to survive in the deep oceans near hydrothermal vents. And some jellyfish actually subsist on the byproducts of photosynthesis of algae, which they harbor inside of their bodies. Since microorganisms have been found living in our upper atmosphere, is it completely too far out to suggest that slightly larger yet still relatively simple life forms might exist up there as well? Otherwise too, perhaps these microorganisms could form the initial building block of a food chain. So, here's the interesting thing, is that when you look at something like a jellyfish, only about 5% of what you're looking at is its actual body. The remaining 95% is water. And so, if there was some sort of organism that had a slightly lighter weight body composition, could we be looking at something that is 95% air, something that is technically lighter than air? So another really interesting thing to note is the trace evidence that is often associated with aerial unknowns, such as angel hair or star jelly. So a quick disclaimer, some of these substances, namely star jelly, have sometimes been misidentified natural substances such as certain types of mold. However, there remain many cases which are completely anomalous and remain unexplained. A good number of these, in both the cases of angel hair and star jelly, have often been viewed by witnesses to fall from the sky, and sometimes in large amounts and sometimes in conjunction with UFO sightings. These substances are often described as melting shortly after falling to Earth, or being unable to be handled or even collected due to their fragile nature. If we're looking at an entity or an organism that is of such a low density composition that it can literally live in our atmosphere, that is exactly what should be expected of its bodily remains or byproducts. So again, I wouldn't classify, an airship with all the bells and whistles as a biological organism. And I would say that a majority of UFO sightings do not fall into this category. However, there are many cases where they possess features that would make them fit into a category of something that's organic as opposed to inorganic. And maybe there is simply life as we don't understand it, sharing our atmospheres with all the other knowns and unknowns that people report. It's a really interesting thought. Before I head out, I would like to let everyone know that you can catch me on Strange Brow Radio from yesterday's date, December 9th. So tune in, especially if you like Twin Peaks. But as for today, I am just another tinfoil hat, signing off.
Doing.